Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Lum, and I'm happy to be giving this presentation here today. Although we're not in person, this is an ironic way to give a presentation about screen fatigue, reading on screen and text accessibility. Perhaps next year we can do one in person where we do a retrospective on COVID and all of the Zoom time we've been doing. Speaking of Zoom time, if there are questions that bleed over after this presentation, I'm setting up a Zoom room for folks to join. I'll put that in the chat. If you have any questions, you can feel free to leave them in the chat, and I'll either handle them in real time or at the end of the presentation. So here's a brief overview of the presentation this afternoon. I'll start off by talking about some of the causes of screen fatigue, and then talk specifically about the challenges related to reading on screen. Oh, someone said I'm on mute, or someone was saying someone else was on mute. All right, I'm gonna assume you can hear me. And then lastly, talking about tips and tools that can help with screen fatigue, and especially with reading on screen.
Yeah, let me see if I can do that. One sec.
So starting off, talking about screen fatigue, I think we're getting some background noise. Let me see if we can. I don't think I can mute that other person, but some of the causes of screen fatigue here. Some relate to vision specifically. Some relate to attention that is drained when you're looking at screens and working on screens. And some are a little bit more emotional. So digging into each one of these vision related impacts of screen fatigue, you've probably heard of glare like in years past, even before COVID and everyone just living on a screen. You'd heard about glare and perhaps about how backlit screens are not as pleasant to look at and to read on as a piece of paper or a book that has, it's a front lit reflective lighting. And these are things that some people have very strong preferences about. Other people don't seem quite so bothered by, but they can have an impact on your visual system and can make you more tired, more fatigued when you're reading for hours and hours on screen or just looking at screens in general. One thing that is a little bit new as we're not just working in offices, but working just from home, not even having a commute, even in the middle of your day, breaking things up, is that you're just at one focal distance all day long. And if you've ever gone to an eye doctor, you might have heard someone say something like, every 20 minutes, spend 20 seconds looking at something that's 20 feet away from you. And that's to give you a little bit of diversity in your focal distance. So you're not just looking at and focusing at one distance, but you're looking at something far away and looking at things up close, as opposed to just looking at things up close. Some of the reasons that we find living on screen to be challenging and fatiguing is related to attention. So for example, you have lots of notifications when you're on your computer, and when you're otherwise sitting at a desk, perhaps reading a book or manual, engaging with colleagues, you're not subject to the same notifications that are always popping in the corner of your screen. Perhaps I'm the only one, but sometimes I even find that if I see a notification come in for something that I know is spam, just seeing that little red number at the bottom of my screen bugs me enough that I'll go and delete that email in the middle of a task, even though there's no reason for me to do it. I literally know it's spam, but I just want to get rid of that little red icon. So these sorts of things call out to you when you're living on a screen. You're being frustrated by them all day long, and your system is just on high alert for all of these notifications. It's also really easy to multitask when you're on a computer. And so it can be tempting to switch back and forth between the news and your work and texting with a spouse or a family member, all the things that you're doing at the same time. And there's a fair amount of research that shows that multitasking is actually not really more efficient than doing one task at a time and switching when you complete a task. But we do it all anyways because it's tempting. It's tempting to respond to notifications when they come in. And there are even some schools of thought that say, if you have an email that will take less than 2 minutes to deal with, you should send it in the moment, just right then. Don't wait to do it later. So there's some people who think this is a good way to handle things. Other people at the other end of the spectrum and say, check your email twice a day, and that's it. But it can be draining when you're living on screen, even more so than just the general office environment, to deal with all of notifications and the temptation to multitask really just all day long as you're perhaps in front of your screen 80 or 90% of your waking hours. And then there's also an emotional component. You're always on when you're on Zoom, for example. You don't know if someone is looking at you. Whereas when you're in a meeting in person, you can tell if other people are looking at you. If they're looking away, you can look away, you can check your phone or do something else if someone's not looking at you. But you don't know when you're on Zoom in these meetings if someone is actually looking at you on their computer. And then you have recorded meetings and things like that. It's difficult to turn off and to feel like you can relax. And another thing is if you work for an international company or if you're a university student taking classes at a university in a different time zone, you may be working for longer hours at stranger hours than you normally would. Just last weekend, my wife was part of a conference and she was put on a panel at 6 a.m. Pacific time. Obviously, they weren't taking into consideration where people were. If the conference had been in person, everyone would have been in the same time zone. But during COVID, people are spread all over the globe. And so you just get put on whatever time zone you're on. And you've got meetings all over the place. And that can be draining as well. Layering on top of this, reading on screen is especially challenging. It's something that we all do quite a bit, but during COVID, we're doing a lot more of it. And there are some specific challenges. Some of them relate to visual teaming, which I'll describe in some detail. Some of them related to text layout, and some of them just related to the endless waterfalls of text that are pouring over us all day long. So visual teaming, what does this mean? Well, earlier I talked about how you have one focal length. When you're just looking at a screen, it's 18 to 20 inches away from your face. And that's not just challenging because it's one focal length, but it's not a relaxing focal length. If you think about how your eyes are angled when you're looking at something at a distance, something a mile away, your eyes are both looking essentially parallel to each other. They're both looking straight forward because the item that you're focusing on is so far away that it's essentially parallel for both of your eyes. Whereas when you're looking at something up close, if you're looking at a book or your phone, your eyes are actually formed into a little triangle. So it's parallel when you're looking at distance, but it's converged is the term for it when you're looking up close. And this is more tiring. It's easier if your eyes can just look both straight forward and parallel, as opposed to having to figure out what is that angle that they need to converge at. And then things get even more complicated when you're reading because you're not just converging at a specific point, you're converging at a point and then moving along and you're sort of changing the shape of that triangle as you go and then doing the sort of carriage return back to the left side of the screen and then moving along through the next line. So you're doing this convergence dance and it gets tiring over time. It's not something that's an easy thing to do. And this sort of visual tracking is not actually natural for humans. If you think about how humans have lived for thousands and thousands of years, it's natural for your eyes to track something that's moving. So if you're in the forest and you're tracking an animal, your eyes follow something that moves. And a baby will do this. A baby's eyes track a thing that moves. But if you put a newspaper in front of a baby, the baby does not move their eyes through the text in the newspaper because that's not a natural thing to do. We don't naturally track our eyes through a fixed screen in the way that we do when we read. So there's not something that's natural for people. That's why visual teaming and the visual tracking that we have to do when reading can get especially fatiguing. Another challenge is text layout. Some of the things that you may have to read may be fixed format. This means that you can't change the flow of the text. If you think about how PDFs are laid out, you can zoom in or zoom out, but you can't increase the text size and then have the text reflow, for example. This can make it challenging to read documents that were not well laid out. If the line spacing is too tight, the paragraphs are too dense, it can be difficult to read. Sometimes people pick fonts that are not very readable because they like the way they look. And perhaps they have a gray text on a gray background because they think it looks nice, but it makes it really difficult to read. You have to read these things on a screen. It's very difficult to do so. Another challenge is monitor orientation. You may have a monitor that's widescreen, But if you're reading a document that's 8.5 by 11 type layout, that's not a great orientation. So that can be challenging because you're having, especially if you have columns, you read down one column and then you have to zoom and get back up to the next column and read back down. This is an unfortunate way to have to do work, but as it happens, most monitors are oriented horizontally. And so it makes it less natural to read this way when you're reading documents that are mostly in portrait format. And then also, you may find now that you're getting some websites that are actually mobile first and were not well thought through for desktop reading. It used to be the opposite problem. It used to be that you'd be on your phone and you'd see a website that was difficult to read because it was made for computers. Now everything is shifting so much in the other direction. I once was on a banking website on my computer. It was a big bank, and for some reason they decided to make their website as if it was only designed to be read on mobile phones. And it was very strange to look at because everything was just not formatted for a computer and it looked terrible and was difficult to navigate. So there can be challenges now if you're working on a desktop computer where things were not designed for desktop computers because so much mobile traffic is coming through compared to desktop traffic. And then lastly, text is just endless, and that makes it hard because work is text. You're reading emails, you're reading documents, you're collaborating, perhaps you're on Slack. Then you take a break and you read some news. Well, news is text. You can watch the news, although people do so less now than they did in the past. It's a lot more reading news from social media links and things like that. And then you take a break and you text with your spouse or your family. Well, that's text too. So there's just a lot of text in your life. And so we spend a lot of time reading. And if you find it to be draining, things you might do to take a break from it actually are not really ending up being a break from it. So those are some of the challenges specifically related to text and reading on screen and how they contribute to screen fatigue. The next thing I'm going to talk about is accessibility and how there are overlaps between accessibility challenges that people have dealt with who have disabilities and some of the challenges related to screen fatigue and things that we can learn from that. So some of the overlaps relate to attention. For example, people who have ADD or ADHD have some of the same issues that we all have when it comes to staying focused, when it comes to not being distracted by things like notifications. So there's some things we can learn there with regard to how we can optimize our lives and our behaviors by managing notifications and things like that. Then visual tracking, this tracking stuff that I mentioned earlier about how our eyes move through text, how that's not especially natural, how it's not easy. This is something that comes up quite a bit among people in the ADHD and ADD and audiences, as well as people with dyslexia. Visual tracking can be a big challenge in these groups, as well as people who have visual impairments, some that specifically relate to visual tracking and make it difficult to read, especially what are called walls of text. People refer to these when they're talking about big paragraphs that are not chunked out into smaller sentences, but just really big blocks of text that people don't enjoy reading and sometimes find intimidating. And then lastly, reading fatigue in general is something that some people, especially with vision impairments or dyslexia, they find reading to be fatiguing either because it is cognitively difficult or because their visual faculties are not great. And so there's some things we can learn from how it is people deal with this to improve our lives as we're dealing with these issues of screen fatigue and reading on screen. So this general concept of taking some of the tools that relate to accessibility and disability inclusion and using them for broader purposes is known as universal design or inclusive design. It's something that's good to know about. It's the notion that we can actually make products and platforms better if we think about people who have disabilities and different abilities, not only because we can make the platforms and products better for those people, but because things that make products and platforms better in those ways can actually also make the platforms better for everyone who uses them, because disabilities are not always permanent. And for example, someone could break a leg and then they have a disability that's temporary. and because we all will have some sort of disability or other if we are so lucky to live as long as as we might, because we're all just going through this earth and we have different ways of perceiving things, and eventually our bodies will all break down in one way or another. So universal design is a great thing to think about, especially if you're here in Silicon Valley and you're building things and thinking about how to make products that are great for everybody. So with that in mind, here are some tips related to screen fatigue. The first is hide your notifications. And this may be something that you're used to doing on your phone. Another cool tip for doing it on your phone is actually to turn your device into black and white or monochrome, which is something that you can do in your settings. And this makes it so that you don't have those red icons calling out to you, which is a really nifty trick. And then you can also do it on your desktop computer. You can turn off notifications. Another thing that I found to be very useful is to hide your dock. If you hide the dock, then you won't even see the applications with the notifications on them, and allows you to focus better if you don't see those notifications at all, but they can still be coming in and you can go check for them when you want. I also recommend trying full screen mode, which is funny for those of us who are old enough to remember what it was like when you could only run a single application on a computer. It was a really big deal when you could run multiple applications. Why would you want to go back from that? Well, nowadays you might want to go back to running a single application in full screen, not necessarily turning off your other applications, though you could certainly quit your mail application and give that a try. But going into full screen mode may help you with your focus, getting engaged and just doing one task at a time. And that's something that I enjoy doing and find to be pretty helpful. Another tip is use text-to-speech or podcasts. When you're reading news, you can sub in podcasts instead, just listen to those. I like to do that when I'm, for example, eating lunch. Instead of reading something on my phone, which might feel natural, if I just listen to a podcast, I can give my eyes a break. I can look out through the window as far away as I can to get some focal variety in my eyeballs, and just munch on a sandwich while listening to a podcast and getting the same news that I would otherwise get if I were doing it that way. If I were reading it on my phone. Another great thing that you can do is if you have ebooks, for example, Kindle books, you can have Alexa read those out loud to you. You can do that on an Alexa-enabled device, or even on your phone. I have an iPhone and I use the Alexa app there to just read a book out loud to me. And the voices that they have now are quite good. It's a pretty natural reading experience, and much better than you might have remembered text-to-speech being in past years. It's very nice to listen to. You can do that for news articles as well, but it's really easy for ebooks if you happen to have those. Most browsers have text-to-speech built in, and operating systems have them built in as well. So you can use this for lots of different things. I'd also recommend taking meetings as a phone call instead of a Zoom call if you can. I like to walk around and take phone calls that way, because I don't have to be looking at the screen. And if it's not something where you need to establish rapport with someone you just met, it can be a great way to catch up and take care of things, but not both be staring at a screen and sedentary for yet another hour. And then lastly, there are visual reading tools that you can use. Some of these help you to read more easily by enlarging text or increasing line spacing or things like that. And if you look in the accessibility section of the Chrome Web Store, for example, or Apple's App Store, you'll find apps related to accessibility, and you may find that some of them are useful for you. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes showing the technology that my own company has created that is a visual reading tool that is used both by general purpose readers and in the accessibility community. And just to show you what that looks like as a new innovation in that space, I'll give you a minute to read this. The company is called Beeline Reader, and this is an example of how this works. So as you can see, the key here is that the text is a color gradient that wraps from the end of a line to the beginning of the next line, and this improves visual tracking. It helps your eyes to move through the text naturally and easily, and it's something that a lot of people enjoy using. It's available on all the major browsers as well as PDF and iOS, and it's been adopted by various education platforms, and it's used at different schools, including some that you may have heard of. I'm happy to chat more with folks. If you have any questions, you can email me at this email address. I also have a Zoom room set up that I'll be joining right after this. You can find me on Twitter at Nick Lummer at Beeline Reader, and I'd love to connect with you. Thanks to everyone who's reached out already, and I'll look forward to talking to folks in the Zoom room.